At 5:40 p.m. on July 1, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt lifted the receiver in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a lavish chateau west of Paris that had formerly housed French aristocracy. The fading sunlight came through the tall windows, illuminating maps marked in red and blue signifying troop positions across Normandy. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German OKW, was on the other end. Speaking from the Wolfschanze, Hitler's heavily fortified command post deep within the East Prussian forest, more than 1,000 miles away, Keitel requested an update on Normandy. His tone clearly betrayed the anxious strain of someone tasked with conveying whatever answer he heard to a leader increasingly out of touch with the war. It had now been 25 days since the Allies landed on June 6. The Americans had just seized Cherbourg, the deep water port that would soon let them channel supplies into France on a massive scale. The British were grinding toward Caen, the vital city controlling the artery roads into France's heartland. German losses were immense: dead, wounded, missing, and captured. Several whole divisions had vanished from wartime organization. Reinforcements were nowhere to be found. The Luftwaffe had lost the ability to contest the skies. The defense was falling apart, little by little, each day. Keitel posed the query Hitler had been pressing his staff for in recent weeks. What course should we take? Von Rundstedt hesitated. The line sputtered with interference. At 68, he was the German army's senior field marshal, a career soldier who had served Germany for more than 5 decades under 3 regimes. He had orchestrated Poland's defeat in 35 days. He had commanded Army Group South through the Ukraine in 1941, crossing 400 miles in 3 months. Had been responsible for defending Western Europe since 1942. Having dedicated his adult life to military study, he knew what must be done. "Call off the war, you fools," he replied. "What other choice remains?" Silence hung on the call. Keitel offered no reply. There was nothing left to say. Von Rundstedt had put into words what every German general staff officer already knew but none dared to voice. The war was irretrievably lost. All that remained to determine was how much Germany would be ruined before unconditional surrender became reality. Within days, von Rundstedt was dismissed. Hitler assigned Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge to replace him, an able commander who nonetheless could do no more to turn the tide than Rundstedt had managed. The conflict would drag on for another 10 months. Millions of lives would be claimed yet. German cities would be shattered. The Red Army would reach Berlin, avenging the atrocities done to the Soviets. And the man who saw and confessed the unwelcome truth, dismissed for his candor, would spend his retirement watching precisely what he had predicted transpire, as he anticipated. The events of those 25 days between D-Day and the infamous phone exchange reveal a great deal about how military institutions lose perspective when honesty is punished. They expose the consequences that arise when leaders refuse to heed those closest to the action. And they embody a broader principle of power. Those who witness a crisis firsthand comprehend it most clearly, whereas those farthest from it possess both the authority to disregard the truth and every motivation to do so. In order to understand the motives behind von Rundstedt's words and why they cost him his role, one must look at what he had observed since spring 1944 and the character he embodied. Gerd von Rundstedt entered the world on December 12, 1875 in Aschersleben, a small settlement in Prussian Saxony. Generations of his family had provided military officers to both Prussia and Germany. For the von Rundstedts, service in arms was not a mere profession, it was a family legacy, a social duty, a core identity. His father had been a lieutenant in the Hessians and subsequently earned the rank of general. His grandfather battled against Napoleon. For young Gerd, the trajectory toward officership was as predictable as his path to literacy. He joined the German army as a cadet in March 1892 at 16. Come 1914, as World War I broke out, he held the rank of captain, serving on a corps staff. Throughout that war, he took up staff assignments, mastering the movement of large bodies of troops, coordination of artillery and infantry, and the logistics upon which campaigns succeed or fail. While he never garnered fame leading from the front lines, he gained a reputation for systematic skill, objective thinking, and unshakable calm in crisis. After Germany's defeat in 1918, von Rundstedt remained with the shrunken professional army that Versailles permitted to Germany. He progressed upward through promotion. By 1932 he led a cavalry division. By 1936 he counted among the German army's most senior generals. When Hitler assumed power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already established, a relic of the old Prussian military class predating the Nazis by generations. Von Rundstedt was never a Nazi. He refused party membership and showed no affection for National Socialist beliefs. He regarded Hitler with a mix of professional reserve and patrician disdain. Privately, he labeled Hitler the Bohemian Corporal, referencing both Hitler's low rank in the World War and his Austrian background. Von Rundstedt's allegiance was to Germany, the state, the army, and the traditions of Prussian service, not to any momentary political regime. Politicians may come and go, yet the military endures, but he fit his class and era, meaning he willingly followed orders from whatever government ruled Germany, regardless of its practices or objectives. When Hitler initiated war, von Rundstedt prosecuted it. He did not question its justice nor resign in protest when Germany invaded Poland despite a recently signed non-aggression pact. He did the work expected and excelled. His September 1939 Polish campaign was a hallmark of combined arms strategy. Commanding Army Group South, he advanced from Silesia towards Warsaw rapidly and efficiently. His columns advanced 200 miles in a fortnight, enveloping Polish formations and stifling their resistance. The operation wrapped up in 35 days. Poland vanished as a sovereign country. In May 1940, von Rundstedt took command of Army Group A for the assault on France. His group executed the critical drive through the Ardennes terrain French command falsely considered impassable to armor. 7 panzer divisions surged over constrained roads and debouched behind France's principal defensive works. 6 weeks later, France had capitulated. This marked the greatest German military feat since the 19th-century wars of German unification. By June 1941, von Rundstedt was again at the helm of Army Group South, spearheading the offensive into the Soviet Union. His troops swept through Ukraine, traversing 400 miles in 3 months and securing Kiev in a vast encirclement. Over 500,000 Soviet troops were either killed or taken prisoner in the so-called Kiev Cauldron. This sealed von Rundstedt's status as one of Germany's premier field commanders. Yet, von Rundstedt saw signs that Nazi ideologues in Berlin ignored. The USSR was not on the brink of collapse. Despite extraordinary casualties, the Red Army failed to surrender. Fresh Soviet formations kept emerging. Factories, having moved beyond the Urals, went on producing tanks and planes. The winter of 1941 halted the Germans just before Moscow. Hitler's promised quick triumph dissolved. That December, von Rundstedt ordered his men to abandon Rostov in southern Russia, which they could no longer defend. This infuriated Hitler, who had explicitly banned retreats. Von Rundstedt tendered his resignation. Hitler accepted. Now von Rundstedt understood firsthand the fate awaiting those who spoke uncomfortable truths to Hitler. However, Germany needed his service. In March 1942, Hitler recalled him, assigning him as Old West commander of all forces along the Atlantic from Norway to Spain, a coastline almost 3,000 miles long. The Allies would attack eventually. Everyone expected it. What remained uncertain was location, timing, and whether German arms could repel the onslaught. On the order of battle, von Rundstedt supposedly commanded scores of divisions. Reality differed. Many lacked strength, experience, or fit soldiers for frontline duty. Some were composed of older men in their 40s, after the loss of younger troops in the east. Other formations were Osttruppen, men from Soviet territory, conscripted or recruited, with dubious loyalty. Their arms were often outdated. The Luftwaffe had forfeited control of Western European skies. Allied bombers delivered blows to German industry both by day and night, and the remaining German fighters were steadily ground down in unequal combat. The Kriegsmarine had suffered defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats still patrolled, but sinkings outpaced launches, allowing Allied convoys from America to Britain to flow unhindered. Von Rundstedt found himself ordered to defend a continent with an exhausted army, beset on every side by foes commanding the air and sea, with no relief in sight and dwindling reserves. He grasped the stark logic. Each month Germany's outlook worsened. Nevertheless, as a soldier, duty demanded he prepare as strong a defense as possible, hoping for fortune to change. The central issue was manpower and material. Germany simply lacked enough men, armor, aircraft, or gasoline to fortify all contingencies. The Atlantic coast stretched for thousands of miles, and the Allies might strike anywhere. Compromises were required. Prioritization and calculated risk became essential. This is where arguments began. Von Rundstedt believed in keeping his panzer divisions well behind the coast, perhaps 100 miles inland, ready as a mobile reserve. His thinking followed standard military doctrine. Strength cannot cover every sector. One must wait for the foe's commitment and then bring concentrated power to bear through counterblow. The Panzer Reserve would be the tool to demolish an Allied foothold once its position was established. Dispersing armor along the whole shore would leave it too weak to stop a major thrust anywhere. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, made commander of Army Group B under von Rundstedt in November 1943, fundamentally disagreed. Rommel, seasoned by campaigns in North Africa against the British and Americans, understood the danger of Allied air dominance. He had seen his supply columns set ablaze on the roads to Tobruk, watched his panzers wrecked by fighter bombers before even arriving at the fight, and suffered under the weight of naval artillery smashing coastal defenses. Rommel held that if the Allies once gained a foothold, German armor would never get near the coast. Their panzers would be destroyed en route by fighter bombers, and Allied warships would decimate counterattacks moving toward the beaches. RML contended that the sole opportunity was to repel the invasion within its first hours as Allied forces began to land before they were able to establish strong positions. He insisted that each tank, gun, and soldier must be situated right at the shoreline. If the Allies could not be repulsed at the water's edge, the defense would collapse. RML was well known for informing his staff that both the Allies and Germany would find the initial 24 hours to be decisive. He referred to this as the longest day. Both perspectives contained legitimate arguments. Von Rundstedt's time-tested approach had proven successful repeatedly throughout the history of warfare. RML's judgment concerning the overwhelming Allied air and naval prowess was correct. Probably, a middle ground would have surpassed the results of each strategy alone, but as was typical, Hitler opted for the least effective solution. He settled the matter by retaining exclusive authority over strategic panzer formations. Commands to move the Panzer-Lehr Division and 12th SS Panzer Division required Hitler's explicit consent. This centralized control eliminated the operational adaptability of the frontline commanders. As a result, when Allied forces landed, those who had direct knowledge of the unfolding situation on the coast had to wait for approval from a leader hundreds of miles away, who had no immediate awareness of the battlefield reality. This inevitably produced delays. Disorganization resulted. The irreplaceable hours after the initial landings ticked away as they waited for clearance that might arrive late or not at all. The date was June 6, 1944, D-Day itself. Across 5 landing sites along a 50-mile span of Normandy's coast, Allied troops came ashore. On Utah Beach, elements of the American 4th Infantry Division landed while suffering relatively low numbers of casualties. However, at Omaha, forces from the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions encountered the German 352nd Infantry Division and were badly mauled, with casualties in the opening hours exceeding 2,000 dead or wounded. British and Canadian troops established presence at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, overcoming determined yet ultimately insufficient opposition. Day 1 saw 156,000 personnel disembark. Air superiority was complete, with 11,000 aircraft in support above the invasion zone. An immense naval fleet close to 7,000 ships delivered the force. This was the largest assembly of warships ever fielded. Over 23,000 paratroopers, with 13,000 of them American, either parachuted or touched down by glider during the night behind German defenses, where they seized key bridges and crossroads, causing widespread disruption to German rear areas. This assault marked the largest amphibious operation in history. Rundstedt received news of the Allied landings at around 6:30 a.m., when coastal defense positions began submitting fragmented reports. The airborne drops had commenced hours earlier. Naval shelling had started well before sunrise. It was immediately evident that this was no limited raid but the start of the main assault. Von Rundstedt made an immediate request to activate the Panzer reserves. The 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr divisions were in positions where they might mount a counteroffensive provided they were authorized to advance. Each hour of holdup provided invaluable time for Allied consolidation. Every minute was crucial. The request went upstream to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof in Bavaria, where he had been living since spring. He had retired between 2 and 3 in the morning after viewing newsreels with Goebbels and Eva Braun. Hitler's personal doctor had administered a sedative for his longtime insomnia. His aides, fearful of his notorious fury, refused to disturb his sleep. The Führer's instructions included explicit demands not to be awakened. Not even Albert Speer, the Minister for Armaments, who arrived at the Berghof around 10 a.m., found Hitler awake. Panzer units stayed in place, engines shut off, crews waiting for directives that never materialized. Precious time slipped by. Allied forces strengthened their lodgements. Additional troops and materiel continued to land. Perimeter positions merged. As the time to deliver a decisive counterblow ebbed away, Hitler finally awoke around noon. He remained indecisive. His belief persisted that Normandy was merely diversionary, anticipating the true invasion at Pas de Calais across the narrowest section of the Channel, only 21 miles from Britain. The Allied deception strategy, codenamed Fortitude, led German intelligence to conclude that a formidable army arrayed under General George Patton was standing ready in southeast England to strike Calais. The entire Normandy campaign, according to Hitler, existed simply to pull German units away from the true target. He opted not to commit panzer reserves while certainty eluded him. These units stayed fixed, awaiting an attack at Calais that would never transpire. The ruse proved so convincing to Hitler that his faith in the illusory force endured for weeks following D-Day, causing him to withhold critical assets from the Normandy fight. Authorizations for panzer movement were delayed until well into the late afternoon, close to 4 p.m. By then, Allied air forces were fully alert. Daytime vehicle columns on French roads were easy targets for Allied fighter bombers, which repeatedly attacked, destroying vehicles, clogging routes, and fomenting chaos. The expected swift deployment turned into a drawn-out hardship. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation sufficiently near to attempt a D-Day counterstrike, initiated a partial counterattack that evening. One battle group reached the shore between two British beaches, but proved too undermanned to exploit its success. By the end of the night, they had retreated after losing 70 of 124 armored vehicles. The critical opening to hurl the Allies back into the sea was over. It would not return. Von Rundstedt watched the events unfold with deepening hopelessness. Every passing hour gave the Allies greater numbers, more armored vehicles, additional artillery. Further time enabled them to bolster their defenses and bring forward further supplies. Each hour diminished any German hope of success, and he remained powerless to intervene. All crucial decisions were made in Bavaria by an individual without battlefield command experience, who declined to visit the front lines, relying instead upon multicolored pins on a map to comprehend conditions obvious only to those present. The initial week confirmed von Rundstedt's dire concerns. The Allies were not retreating. Rather, they entrenched themselves, accumulating men and materiel in preparation for a breakout into France. German counter-offensives failed repeatedly. When the 12th SS Panzer Division finally entered the fighting, their assaults inflicted significant Allied casualties but ultimately failed to expel them from their positions. Panzerlehr Germany's premier armored division was committed incrementally and began sustaining irreplaceable losses. Reinforcements became scarce as Allied air operations demolished bridges and railway lines across France. The extensive obliteration of French rail infrastructure, commenced in the lead-up to D-Day, now fully impacted German logistics. Units expected to reach Normandy in mere days required weeks instead. The French resistance escalated confusion by sabotaging communications and convoys, supplying intelligence to the Allies. The front was settling into a stalemate, but one that now favored the Allied side. On June 17, less than 2 weeks after the landings, Rundstedt and Rommel participated in a meeting with Hitler at Margeval, a fortified command bunker near Soissons known as Wolfschlucht II, constructed in 1940 for the planned invasion of Britain. This was the only occasion on which Hitler visited the facility. It also marked Hitler's first journey to France since the 1940 armistice. He had consistently refused requests to come to the front in person, insisting instead on remaining far behind in fortified bunkers. This time, he traveled from Berghof to Metz by air the previous day, then continued by car through the night. Hitler reached the site appearing pale and fatigued, his hands visibly shaking. He moved with a stooped posture, replaced his former vigor with anxious restlessness that unsettled his officers. It would be later realized that Hitler was developing Parkinson's disease, though at the time, most attributed his condition to stress and exhaustion. Rommel addressed the conference first. He spoke directly. The situation at the front was precarious. Germany's forces suffered over 2,500 casualties per day, and only about 1,000 replacements were arriving daily. Allied forces had utterly dominated the air. German troops became stationary during daylight, unable to move, resupply, or reinforce without being bombarded from above. Each day saw Allied buildup increase, as German capability waned. The numbers were inescapable. Without drastic change, the front could not endure. Rommel warned Hitler about the political stakes. If military victory in the West proved unattainable, a diplomatic route might preserve some negotiating leverage before total defeat foreclosed any hope of talks. Hitler exploded in anger, accusing Rommel of pessimism and defeatism. He charged that Rommel lacked faith and failed to understand the strategic context. Hitler maintained that forthcoming advanced weaponry could still reverse their fortunes. B-1 flying bombs had begun hitting London, and V-2 rockets would follow. Jets would gain dominance in the air. He was adamant. No withdrawal, no fallback positions. Every patch of ground was to be defended to the last soldier. Sheer will would prevail over material disadvantage. Belief would overcome the arithmetic. He demanded that Cherbourg be held at all costs. The meeting ended abruptly when a stray V-1 fell nearby, forcing all present to scramble for safety. Von Rundstedt said almost nothing during these exchanges. He recognized that debating with Hitler was futile. The Führer no longer responded to rational argument, following instead his instincts and private convictions, despite lacking any practical military command background. Von Rundstedt later judged the discussion a failure. The same man who had previously gambled boldly on realistic intelligence now clung to fantasies of miraculous weapons and unshakable willpower. The meeting yielded no fundamental change to strategy. The orders remained stand firm everywhere, counterattack when the chance arose, expect miracle weapons, maintain confidence. Rundstedt and Rommel returned to their posts, fully aware their efforts to redirect policy had failed. The facts had been presented, the situation explained. They had still been ignored. Both officers understood the war would continue until Germany was completely conquered, as the decision-maker would tolerate no alternative. In the days that followed, matters worsened rapidly. By June 18, the Americans had isolated the Cotentin Peninsula, surrounding the Cherbourg fortress with its critically important port. Hitler repeated his directive to resist to the last man. The defenders fought staunchly, but American artillery and infantry proved unstoppable. The city was captured between June 26 and 27 after fierce resistance, and finally the fortress commander surrendered. The port's defenses lasted until June 29 before surrendering. American engineers soon rendered the facilities usable. Within a few months, the port handled 14,000 tons of cargo daily. Concurrently, the British pressed toward Caen, a key target General Bernard Montgomery had hoped to seize on D-Day. 3 weeks post-landing, Caen remained under German control. However, the defense of the city was absorbing the German armored reserve at an unsustainable rate. Operation Epsom, starting June 26, brought British units within 2 miles of Caen before being checked by determined German resistance. The cost of repulsing British advances, however, was grievous. Germany lost significant numbers of tanks and seasoned crews they could not replace. The panzer divisions that von Rundstedt had preferred to keep as mobile reserves were instead ground down in stationary defensive actions. Each day, many tanks were lost to naval gunfire, artillery barrages, attack by fighter bombers, and the advance of Allied tanks. Daily, seasoned crews, whose training had taken years, were either killed or injured. The German forces fighting in the Western Front were suffering immense casualties, defending territory that, ultimately, would be surrendered. Von Rundstedt understood this reality. Rommel saw it as well. So did the commanders directly involved in the fighting. The only one who would not acknowledge this truth was Hitler. On June 29, von Rundstedt and Rommel had another meeting with Hitler, this time at the Berghof, his retreat in the Bavarian Alps. They traveled by plane from France to Germany, a trip lasting several hours, leaving behind a front that was rapidly disintegrating. That the field marshals were compelled to cover 1,000 miles merely to confer with their supreme commander was symptomatic of the dysfunction within the German command structure. Rommel again described the reality on the ground with unmistakable clarity. The line could not hold out forever. He stated, "Our men fight valiantly, but rifles cannot combat tanks. Machine guns cannot keep out aircraft. Every day, we're forced to yield ground that cannot be recaptured. The Allies' strength keeps rising, while ours drains away. The real issue is whether we lose quickly or slowly, whether we squander our remaining forces defending land with no value or try to preserve the army for a stand that could actually work." In response, Hitler put forth his usual claims. Reinforcements were on their way. Wonder weapons would annihilate England. The unity between Western allies and the Soviet Union would unravel. Mounting casualties would drain Western democratic resolve. Victory, he insisted, was possible if they could simply hold out long enough. At last, von Rundstedt voiced his thoughts. He had heard these optimistic assertions for months and saw them prove false time and again. He was tired of polite, fruitless discussion. "The war in the West is over," he announced. "It is not a question of losing, but a matter of defeat already being absolute. The only issue is when Germany will be beaten and what the final cost will be. With each passing day, more German soldiers perish needlessly. With each day, more German cities are annihilated. The only sane option is to bring hostilities to a stop before Germany is completely ruined." Hitler gazed at him in silence. An oppressive hush fell. The other officers averted their eyes, reluctant to seem complicit in such perilous honesty. Hitler's reply erupted, his anger clear. He charged von Rundstedt with cowardice, defeatism, and accused him of betraying Germany and its fighting men. Hitler insisted victory could still be secured if the generals possessed the will. All that was needed was battle with the unwavering resolve he demanded. The conference ended inconclusively. Nothing shifted. No change occurred. Von Rundstedt and Rommel returned to France fully aware that their straightforward warnings had been rejected outright. 2 days later, on July 1, 1944, a phone call arrived from Keitel. It was prompted by the collapse of the defensive line around Cherbourg and the worsening crisis on the Cotentin Peninsula. That afternoon, Germany's High Command countermanded von Rundstedt's orders, permitting armored divisions to pull back from the range of Allied naval fire near Caen. Keitel, speaking for Hitler, wanted advice for stabilizing the front. Von Rundstedt, at the end of his patience, had issued warnings and seen them dismissed for weeks while his troops died in a lost cause. When Keitel asked for his recommendation, von Rundstedt gave the only answer left: "End the war, you fools. What else is there to do?" His words were undiplomatic, lacking the usual careful phrasing reserved for exchanges with political leaders. There were no caveats or gentle alternatives, just unsparing, plain language, a declaration that finished von Rundstedt's command. Hitler's reaction was immediate. On July 2, Hitler released a dismissal order. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge was summoned and made Commander-in-Chief West. Von Rundstedt was ordered to return home and wait for new instructions. The official explanation cited his advanced age and poor health. There was no court-martial, no scandal, no dramatic showdown. Hitler needed to maintain the illusion of support from the old Prussian officer tradition, as well as the credibility that a figure like von Rundstedt brought. Nevertheless, von Rundstedt's career in active duty seemed finished. His truthfulness was unacceptable. What occurred next affirmed all of von Rundstedt's warnings. Von Kluge arrived, convinced he could attain what von Rundstedt had not. He possessed a successful command record on the Eastern Front and thought he could restore stability in the West. Very soon, he realized the situation was precisely as dire as von Rundstedt had described, if not more so. The Allied offensive proved unstoppable. On July 20, 1944, less than 3 weeks following von Rundstedt's dismissal, German officers tried to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a time bomb in a briefcase and hid it under a table at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, during a briefing. The explosion occurred at 12:42 p.m., killing 4, wounding many more. Hitler survived. A sturdy oak table shielded him from the worst of the blast. Despite burst eardrums, burns, and splinter injuries, Hitler lived. The plot unraveled in hours. Its planners, believing Hitler had died, started implementing their coup operation Valkyrie. When it became known that Hitler survived, the plan rapidly failed. The conspirators were apprehended, tortured, and executed. Stauffenberg died by firing squad at the Bendler block. His last words: "Long live sacred Germany." Others were hanged with piano wire from hooks, their executions filmed for Hitler's viewing. Thousands more were rounded up in the ensuing Gestapo purge, even those only tenuously linked to the resistance. Nearly 5,000 people were put to death over the assassination attempt. Rommel found himself implicated in the plot. He had foreknowledge of the plans and failed to report them. While some evidence hinted at deeper involvement, he denied such claims under questioning. The case against him was strong enough that even Hitler could not ignore it. Yet Rommel's popular appeal made a trial impractical. His North African successes had made him a household name. Any trial would have exposed that Germany's top general opposed the regime. Rommel faced an ultimatum: stand before the People's Court ensuring a conviction, execution, and persecution of his family, or swallow poison, thus dying a hero with his family protected and reputation secure. The authorities would announce his death was from wounds by a strafing raid. He would receive a state funeral. On October 14, 1944, Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Mazel came to Rommel's house in Herrlingen bearing poison. Rommel lay recovering from wounds sustained in July when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft. He said farewell to his wife, Lucy, and son, Manfred. He left his house, entered the waiting car, and ingested the cyanide. Rommel was 52, the man who had best grasped the Normandy situation, who had urged Hitler toward peace while it remained possible, was dead, executed for seeing the truth. The subsequent state funeral portrayed him as a hero killed by his wounds. Von Kluge fared no better. In early August, a U.S. breakthrough at St. Lo fractured the German front lines. Operation Cobra ripped through German defenses, allowing Allied armor to move into the French heartland. Von Kluge ordered a counterstrike at Mortain, acting on Hitler's orders despite knowing it was doomed. The effort failed. German units faced near encirclement at Falaise as Allied troops closed the gap. More than 50,000 German soldiers died or were captured during the Falaise Pocket Battle. The German 7th Army was eliminated as an effective force. Hitler, suspecting von Kluge of seeking talks with the Allies, recalled him to Berlin. On August 19, 1944, on the way to Germany near Metz, von Kluge stopped his car and took cyanide. He died at 61, leaving behind a letter imploring Hitler to summon the strength to end the futile conflict. The letter was ignored. The pattern was obvious: any senior leader who recognized harsh realities and refused silence was destroyed. Hitler surrounded himself with officers who told him what he wished to hear and removed those who told the truth. The regime punished honesty and rewarded fantasy, sealing its own fate. In the interim, events unfolded just as von Rundstedt had foretold. Paris was liberated by French forces with American assistance on August 25, 1944. By September, Allied troops reached Germany's border. Belgium, the Netherlands, and most of France had been freed. The Wehrmacht in the West suffered more than 400,000 casualties since D-Day. Even after von Rundstedt announced defeat in July, the conflict dragged on for 8 more months. Bombing raids intensified. German cities like Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were reduced to ruins. Hundreds of thousands of civilians perished. Factories stopped producing. Road and rail transport broke down. Despite overwhelming destruction, Nazi leaders still promised victory. The situation was even more disastrous in the East. The Soviets launched Operation Bagration on June 23, 1944, delivering a defeat to Army Group Center, deadlier than Stalingrad. Soviet forces covered 400 miles in 2 months, encircling Warsaw by August. By January 1945, they reached the Oder, less than 50 miles from Berlin. The conflict cost millions of lives, both military and civilian, persisting only because Hitler refused to face reality and his followers either feared him or were blindly loyal. Yet, strangely, von Rundstedt's involvement did not end. In September 1944, with Germany beset by invasion on 2 fronts, Hitler summoned von Rundstedt back to take charge. The veteran field marshal was restored as commander-in-chief West, the very post from which he had been dismissed. The reason was simple: capable generals were either dead, in prison, shamed, or exhausted. Hitler required a prestigious, experienced figure to hold together a fracturing army, someone respected by the officer corps. Von Rundstedt agreed to return. At 69, burdened by heart disease and fatigue, he accepted, knowing full well that his only role would be to oversee disaster, not avert it. The war was lost, everyone but Hitler knew as much. Still, the battle continued. Soldiers kept dying, and orders had to be given, however meaningless they were. In December 1944, Hitler organized his final great attack in the West. The Ardennes offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's plan, not von Rundstedt's. The field marshal had opposed it from the outset, believing the forces assigned were far too small to reach their ambitious goals. He assessed that the supply situation rendered prolonged offensives unfeasible. He believed the entire plan lacked strategic validity, deeming it a risk destined to fail and destined to exhaust Germany's remaining reserves. There simply was not enough fuel to reach Antwerp, which was the officially stated target. The Luftwaffe was incapable of delivering consistent air support. Even if the offensive succeeded in breaking through, there would be no means to exploit or maintain the gains. Von Rundstedt suggested a more restrained plan, the small solution which could have gained limited local victories without risking all available resources. Hitler turned down this proposal. The assault would continue according to his original directive. On December 16, 1944, the offensive began with roughly 30 divisions, representing Germany's last major operational reserves. Complete tactical surprise was achieved. The Americans were taken off guard, believing that Germany no longer retained the means to mount an attack. The defensive line collapsed. An American front protrusion 50 miles deep developed. Portions of units were overwhelmed. Other formations retreated in disarray. For several days, It appeared as though Hitler's risk might bear fruit. Yet von Rundstedt's judgment remained accurate in all essential respects. The offensive's progress was halted due to lack of fuel, never reaching its set goals. German tanks waited immobilized by empty fuel tanks along the roads. They became vulnerable targets for Allied aircraft when the skies cleared. American resistance at strategic sites, especially Bastogne, stalled the German advance and disrupted their operational schedule. Once the weather improved after Christmas, Allied air power resumed with highly destructive results. The bulge in the Allied lines began to recede. By the end of January 1945, German forces had returned to their initial starting points, sustaining around 100,000 casualties and losing about 800 tanks that could not be replaced. The Ardennes offensive achieved nothing aside from hastening Germany's collapse by burning through resources that could only have extended the struggle by a few more weeks. The Ardennes marked the definitive end of Germany's offensive strength. After this defeat, only withdrawal, defense, and surrender remained. Von Rundstedt recognized this reality. Every officer with any real understanding of the military situation recognized this as well. Yet the hostilities went on because a single individual refused to let them cease. In March 1945, von Rundstedt was removed from command for the last time. On March 7, American troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, taking it intact and crossing the Rhine River. No enemy force had crossed the Rhine since the time of Napoleon. Hitler required a scapegoat for the failure to destroy the bridge. Von Rundstedt had played no part in any decisions regarding demolition, nor in preparations or the unsuccessful attempt, but he was the top field commander. He was therefore relieved of his command and succeeded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Von Rundstedt returned to his family. By then, he was 69, worn down, and in poor health. His military career spanned over 50 years in Germany's service. He had commanded forces in 3 separate wars. He had achieved significant victories as well as witnessing immense defeats. Ultimately, he was vindicated in his assessments on every crucial point and penalized for being correct. Germany unconditionally surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hitler, on April 30, died by suicide in his bunker in Berlin as the Soviets encircled the city. The Third Reich, heralded as lasting 1,000 years, had endured for only 12 years and 4 months. The European conflict resulted in approximately 40 million deaths, including 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust. Germany was left devastated, its territory split among the victors, urban landscapes in ruins, millions of citizens displaced, and its national future left dubious. On May 1, 1945, von Rundstedt was apprehended by the 36th Infantry Division of the United States at a hospital in Bad Tals, where he was being treated for a serious leg condition and heart ailments. He became a prisoner of war but was afforded the respect appropriate to his age and rank. The American authorities were uncertain how best to proceed with his case. He indisputably held a senior command under Hitler during the conflict. At the same time, he was considered a career officer who appeared to have opposed certain Nazi policies and had twice been dismissed for his candor. In January 1949, von Rundstedt faced charges of war crimes brought by the British authorities. The principal charges related to his handling of prisoners of war and the execution of captured Allied commandos under Hitler's infamous order, which dictated immediate shooting of all commandos upon capture rather than their treatment as prisoners. Von Rundstedt had passed on this order to units within his command. Allied commandos were indeed executed because of this. The court case did not progress. Von Rundstedt's physical condition deteriorated to the point where he could not attend court sessions. The British government ultimately decided that prosecuting an elderly man in poor health would not yield any significant benefit. The charges were therefore withdrawn. He was released from detention in May 1949. Von Rundstedt's last years were spent in retirement near Celle, a small town in Lower Saxony in the British zone. He lived quietly with his spouse, shunning publicity and only occasionally granting interviews to military historians interested in his viewpoint on the conflict. He consistently avoided discussing the Nazi era or his own responsibilities during that period. When questioned about Hitler, he was curt without showing regret. In talking about the war, his approach was analytical, but rarely showed personal introspection. He neither wrote an autobiography nor attempted to publish any explanations for his wartime actions. He made no efforts to clarify his motivations to either the public or future generations. Whether this reticence stemmed from continued health problems, personal stoicism, or an avoidance of difficult truths about his own actions has never been conclusively determined. General von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953 at age 77. His burial with military honors took place at Stocken Cemetery in Hanover. More than 2,000 people were present at his funeral. The gravestone is a simple marker displaying his name, rank and lifespan. It omits references to his career, successes, failures, or any reference to his famous retort to Hitler. The issue that scholars continue to contest is what von Rundstedt's story reveals regarding accountability in armed conflict and in hierarchical organizations more broadly. Some maintain von Rundstedt was one more officer serving a criminal regime, and that his aristocratic disdain for Hitler did not prevent him from following orders, that his competence as a military leader enabled atrocities even if he did not issue those orders personally, and that he at least contributed to them. The allegations of war crimes against him were genuine. The commando order he relayed led directly to the deaths of captured Allied personnel who, by the laws of war, ought to have been protected. The campaigns he led in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union caused millions of deaths. His military prowess helped further the objectives of a criminal government. Another viewpoint holds that von Rundstedt epitomized the tragedy of career soldiers trapped within a criminal apparatus, not as an ideological adherent, but as an expert who followed the state's directives without examining their ultimate purposes. His well-known exchange with Hitler demonstrated a man who perceived the reality, yet was powerless to act upon it apart from voicing his opinion. These analysts assert that his adherence to duty, shaped by a tradition of obedience that offered no latitude for moral initiative, and a lifetime's training in following commands rather than questioning them, prevented independent ethical action. Both perspectives may have some validity. It is possible that von Rundstedt was at once a proficient tactician, an enabler of wrongdoing through inaction, a clear-sighted realist, and a moral disappointment. People are frequently inconsistent. History does not provide neat classifications that fully reflect the complexities of individual experience. What is certain is that von Rundstedt recognized what was occurring more accurately than virtually all his peers in the German command. Within 25 days after D-Day, he recognized the war was irretrievably lost. He realized further fighting would only magnify the devastation. He comprehended that seeking peace early was the only remaining rational option while something could still be salvaged. His assessment was correct. Subsequent events affirmed his judgment. The Ardennes battle merely squandered Germany's last resources futilely. Defending the Rhine was only a delaying tactic, resulting in more casualties for very little benefit. The defense of Berlin was a needless slaughter without military justification. Every additional day of the war after July 1, 1944 resulted in unnecessary deaths of both Germans and Allies, without changing the inevitable